but let's try again.
Okay.
So I am Jane Hunter. I'm the leader of Englewood Indivisible, and I want to welcome you to tonight's program with Dr. Dale Anderson. It's brought to you by the Indivisible Florida Network. That's 19 local indivisible groups around the state of Florida. We hope if you are an indivisible group, you'll consider joining us. And we also hope if you're not affiliated, you can look at our website, which is right here, indivisibleflorida.org, and you can find yourself a group near you, because we would love to work with you. And I think without further ado, I'm going to introduce Mary Lawrence, who is the leader of Indivisible St. John's, and she will introduce our speaker.
Welcome, everybody, and thank you so much for showing up tonight. We're pretty excited to have Dr. Dale Anderson back. Many of you on the call tonight have probably had the pleasure of his presentations. He traveled the state last year talking about fascism, way ahead of his time, I might add. And his presentations are well researched, they're powerful, they're fast moving, and you're going to learn a lot tonight. So we're really, really grateful he's able to do this for us. Tonight, we're going to cover the stakes of the 2020 election, the infamous HR 1 that will probably never see the light of day, but it's good to talk about it because anything's possible after November. Creating a Democratic landslide, what the GOP is going to try to pull this time around, and we're already, just since we booked Dale, things have gotten so much worse. So he's prepared to follow along that dark path too for us. His background is he's a retired physician, and he practiced in internal and emergency medicine. And then subsequent to that, he had years of experience leading large medical groups in a management capacity. So he knows whereof he speaks as far as organization and putting information together in a coherent fashion. So really hope you enjoy this. Dale's got a lot of slides to share, and the floor is yours. I give you Dr. Dale Anderson.
Good evening, and thank you, Mary, and thank you, Jane. I'm going to pull up my presentation in a second, but just a little reflection. We have about, 10 weeks to find out if we still have a democracy. I think that my message tonight is that it has to be all stops out over the next 10 weeks. And I don't know if my thinking is like yours, but I have to almost stop everything else I'm doing now and spend all the time over these next 10 weeks focused on this issue, and that takes some major change in my life. What I'd like to walk through tonight, though, is just kind of an overview of where we are. So I'm going to bring up my PowerPoint, and did everybody see that okay?
Yep.
All right. So I've called this voter suppression and democracy degradation. And what I want to cover are the stakes of the 2020 election, our pathway to autocracy, the GOP's voter suppression strategy, this whole controversy around vote at home, and then talk a little bit about HR 1. So what are these stakes? This is what comes to my mind in terms of the stakes of this election. Our democracy is at stake. It feels like we're sliding into an autocracy. The second thing is this may be one of our last chance to really extract what the Russian hold on our politics if the Republicans remain in power over the next 4 years. We need to rejoin the international community, counter authoritarian regimes around the world which are being empowered, and of course combat climate threat. On a more local level, we need to position ourselves to win back as many of the seats as we can at the state legislative level because of redistricting, protect a liberal Supreme Court seat or two, rescue Obamacare, prevent an assault on our safety network, and stop the corruption of our judicial system. So what happened in this pathway to autocracy? It started in 2016 when a troubled democracy, out of a troubled democracy, and a demagogue arose. Donald Trump is a classic, as I've presented before, a classic demagogue, and they tend to come to the surface in troubled democracies. It was way back in 2016 that the Washington Post, this was before he was elected, had this survey where they said, well, how fascist is Trump? And they asked academics to, just on the basis of his speech, this is before he'd even taken office, just on the basis of watching him speak, and they gave him 26 out of 44 Benitos, where these are kind of the criteria that they were using to talk about what is a fascist personality. And, you know, if you look down this list, many of them, the scores are much higher. For instance, number 10, at the time, hierarchical party structure and a tendency to curse the disloyal was only given a 1 score, and certainly he would be a 4 under, for instance, as would his militarism. But the second thing then is as he began campaigning, it was clear from some observers that he was using fascist tactics to gain power. And the best source that I found for that was Jason Stanley's book, How Fascism Worked. And remember, Jason Stanley began listing some of these things. This us versus them, attacking minorities, claiming to return to a mythical past, a belligerent nationalism, caring only for your own country and just seeing out all other countries as being out to get your dollar. Continuous propaganda and lies, conspiracy theories, creating unreality, elevating the patriarchal family, constantly claiming to be a victim, attacking expertise and intellectuals, this binary approach to law and order where we, the whites, are law-abiding, you, people of color, are criminals, threatening the free press, demeaning urbanism and multiculturalism, abandoning human rights. He used all of these techniques, and we hadn't seen this among the politicians in the United States for decades. So once he then gained power and won the election, he moved away from that fascist demagoguery, although he continues to use it some, but he moved to what I call the authoritarian playbook. That once in power, he moves to really a very standard set of things that authoritarians do to undermine a democracy. And that's from January 27th to the present, he's been playing from this playbook. And it's best described in a couple books, How Democracies Die, by Steve Levitsky, and Larry Diamond's Ill Winds. Larry Diamond's a professor, I think, at Stanford. And in these circumstances, the democracy dies not by a military coup, but by an executive coup. Larry Diamond described these 12-step program for autocrats in his book, Ill Winds. You can look down this list of 12 steps, and he says once you get to the bottom, you start at the top and keep working. And over the past three and a half years, this is basically what Donald Trump has done. Demonizing political opposition, undermining the courts, undermining the media. He actually, I had this as a negative, gained control of public broadcasting, but he had Fox Network, which was almost like his own personal radio. But even more disturbing was recently when he replaced all the leadership of the U.S. Broadcasting Network, which is Voice of America, and put his own people in place, positioning himself, I believe, for his own broadcasting personal government network if Fox News abandons him. He intimidated the business community, enriched his class of cronies with contracts and other activities, taking political control of state agencies. Certainly Bill Barr has been the architect to help him with that. The Justice Department, rigging election rules, gaining control over electoral administration, And this is basically what his playbook has been for 3.5 years. Robert Reich in the New York Times in June 11th, 2020, said the debate over the word fascism takes a new turn. And he says on June 2nd that police officers across the country deployed brutal tactics in response to protests over the killing of George Floyd. He said that that his old vocabulary, already crowded with harsh words for President Donald Trump, was making addition for a new addition. And he said, I've held off using the F word for 3.5 years, but there is no longer any honest alternative. Trump is a fascist, and he is promoting fascism in America. And this is interesting that it's so late in the game that people are coming out and identifying what we're seeing, because the Europeans have known for some time as they've watched what's happening that this is the standard authoritarian fascist playbook. Our own media has really dropped the ball. What they referred to whenever Trump would take any of those steps on the playbook, they would call it Trumpian or unprecedented or unusual, but they wouldn't put the picture of that this is following an authoritarian fascist type of playbook. Robert Reich even published this just a week ago, which is his own list of what is the authoritarian playbook. You can look down this whole piece, and I will, of course, I'll send this PowerPoint to your leaders so that they can be distributed if you want to kind of look back and read some of his comments on this. But it's the same list of activities. So these things are pretty well known. They just weren't communicated well to the American public that have not experienced an authoritarian attempt to take over. This playbook has worked very well in Hungary. In many ways, Hungary is no longer a democracy. When the party took control, Fidesz got 2/3 control of the parliament in 2010. Redistricting occurred, gerrymandering. The Supreme Court was expanded, and anyone over 62 was retired. The seats were appointed by Fidesz, Viktor Orban's party. Civil servants were fired and partisans were put in place. The state broadcasting network became controlled by Fidesz, and all private media were forced to sell to Orban's associated oligarchs, so that he controls 90% of the media in Hungary. And then he used Emergency Powers Act related to COVID to extend, to really take over a lot of additional powers. So the playbook works. And of course, Donald Trump showered praise on Viktor Orban when he visited in 2019, doing a tremendous job, and shrugged off all of these activities related to the democracy. Trump has given a green light to authoritarians globally. He's looked the other way in Hong Kong. He's looked the other way in Yemen when Saudis attacked Yemen. He's looked the other way when in Israel, where the West Bank was under risk of being taken. He's looked the other way in Ukraine, and more recently, he's looking the other way as Modi and India is looking at expansion in Kashmir. So he's given basically a green light to his people that he sees as powerful leaders that he would like to be. In an article called The Fragile Republic that was published just in this last Foreign Affairs magazine by Susan Mettler and Robert Lieberman, they look back at American history and say, you know, we've had times when authoritarian leaders or authoritarian parties came close to taking control. And they typically occurred when there was intense political polarization, conflict about who was an American and who wasn't, high economic inequality, and excessive executive power. And they argue that never before have all four of those come together as it has in 2020, where we're facing all of those, which heightens the risk for an authoritarian takeover. They also commented that it's typically thought that when income inequality is intense, that it's the lower class that rises up against the wealthy and creates a crisis. But they say rather as inequality grows, it is the affluent themselves who are more likely to mobilize effectively. They realize that working and middle-class people greatly outnumber them, tend to favor redistributive policies, and so fearful of such policy changes, the rich take action to protect their interests and preserve their wealth. This can occur with the wealthiest citizens decide to solidify their power, even if it entails harm to the democracy. They may be willing to abide a polarizing politics of us versus them, and the adoption of repressive measures if that is what it takes for leaders to protect their interests. So you have the oil industry, the 1%, you have the corporations, and you have the evangelical Christian right. They're all under pressure and intense pushback about their power in the society, and they have come together behind this party. So Trump in the playbook. We've said before that the 3 steps that Levinsky and Mickey and Way in their article said: politicize state institutions, neutralize key parts of the civil society, and rewrite the rules of political game. Those are the playbook activities. And they're aimed at attacking the 3 pillars of our democracy: liberal rights, the rule of law, and the democratic electoral system. Those are really the pillars of our constitutional liberal democracy. And if you start, there's a book by Tom Ginsburg from the University of Chicago on how to save a constitutional democracy. It really is an excellent overview of this issue. But if you start with the rule of law, in many ways, it's almost dead. Trump, the GOP, and Barr have pardoned Joe Arpaio, the actions related to Roger Stone, Manafort, Flynn, their investigation of former FBI agents, all of these things using the Justice Department as a weapon and as a protection are undermining the rule of law. So in February 2020, over 2,000 alumni of the Department of Justice, both Democrats and Republicans, asked for William Barr's resignation over his interference in the Roger Stone sentencing. Then again, in May 11th, they sent another letter with over 2,000 alumni, again asking for his resignation for his interference in the Michael Flynn case. They said that governments use their enormous power of law enforcement to punish their enemies and reward their allies are not constitutional republics. They are autocracies. Regarding the liberal rights, the pillar of liberal rights, we know that Donald Trump from the beginning has been assaulting the press, criminalizing protests, and attacking civic organizations. They've tried to label George Soros and his organization a domestic terrorist organization, tried to label Antifa as terrorists, and recently are threatening the Southern Poverty Law Center. And finally, the third pillar is the one we're talking about most tonight, which is their attack on the election process. In their book, How to Rig an Election, Brian Klaus and Nick Cheeseman have this list of 5 primary methods: voter suppression, hacking, gerrymandering, and then internationally, more so than in the United States, buying votes, stuffing the ballot box. We know that we are at this point where this demagogue and his party have won the presidency and for 4 years have been playing on the playbook. The real question is, in 2020, are we going to get past this and save our democracy? It's hard to believe we're saying that. So let's talk about voter suppression. It's a strategy used to influence the outcome of the election by discouraging or preventing specific groups of people, specific groups from voting. It's distinguished from political campaigning that attempts to change the opinion of voters through persuasion and organization. A very fundamental difference in how you win elections. One of the best books on this subject was by Carol Anderson, who's she's an academic of African American Studies at Emory. She has 2 great books. White Rage is a bestseller, and then One Person, One Vote is her treatise on this issue of voter suppression. She comments that until the 1960s, when we had the Civil Rights Bill, Voter suppression in the South was primarily a direct form of disenfranchisement. It was violent. It was fraudulent. There were poll taxes, literacy tests, restrictive registration, and restrictions such as just white primaries. Only white people were allowed in the primaries. But since the Civil Rights Bill of the 60s, voter suppression has been indirect. It's ID laws, threatening messages, limiting access to the polls, restricting registration drives, caging and purging voters, challenging signatures, poll watchers. One of the best summaries of this is this video by Jeffrey Wright called Rigged. You can get it on YouTube. It's called the Voter Suppression Playbook. It's worth watching because it goes back and it talks about the voter suppression playbook since 2008 when Project Red Map was started by the Republicans. And they took control of state legislatures in 2011 during that redistricting cycle. Were able to gerrymander these states and then put in all of these restrictive voting activities. So free and fair elections, who are the agents of voter suppression? They're the conservative Supreme Court, they're the Republican governors and state legislatures, they're the state election officials in Republican states, they're Trump and the GOP and the RNC, and they're the Russians. And these are the groups. Think of the power behind this group and the money that comes from their backers to try and win elections through voter suppression. From the court standpoint, in the last 10 years, the Citizens United allowed the flooding of elections with dark money. Shelby versus Holder in 2013 was gutted the Voting Rights Act and allowed a lot of those southern states to return to their voter suppression tactics. Husted versus Randolph in 2018 failed to stop purging. And then in Ruck versus Common Cause in 2019, the court refused to set standards for redistricting and prevent gerrymandering. And all of these were 5 to 4 votes, with the conservative Republican appointed members not supporting our democracy, not protecting voters. In the gutting of the Voting Rights Act in Shelby in 2013, Justice Roberts said, while disparities in voting registration and turnout was compelling evidence in 1965, there was no longer such a disparity. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg wrote in her dissent, throwing out pre-clearance when it worked and is continuing to work is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. And it was one of the really terrible decisions to allow the states to go back and institute a lot of repressive activities. So once freed, they put up barriers to voter registration, limited the voting window, required more IDs, put together onerous vote-by-mail requirements in some states, disenfranchised felons, raised the bar for position initiatives, threatened voter registration activists, chose insecure voting machines, and tried election nullification in some states. When you think about the states, how different they manage their election process, compare Washington state to Mississippi. The best registration practices are those that are shown on the left: online voter registration, automatic registration, same day, and pre-registration. All 4 are available if you're a citizen in Washington state. None of them are available in Mississippi. They have no online registration. And as far as voting best practices, early voting of at least 14 days, no excuse absentee voting, vote from home, and rights restoration. Again, Washington state has all of those available, Mississippi none. So there's this vast difference in how someone can vote on federal elections across the state, and it's one of the reasons H.R. 1 is so critical to create some best practice standards. In her book, One Person, No Vote, Carol Anderson reported that after the gutting of the Voting Rights Act, Alabama put voter ID laws in place that eliminated bank statements and other documents as proof of residence required a government-issued ID. They wouldn't accept government-issued photos from public housing. And there were about 250,000 citizens who would have to go get a government ID to vote. Governor Bentley then closed the DMV locations in the 6 counties with the highest percentage of African Americans, resulting that 1/3 of voting age population had to travel over 10 miles to get to the nearest site in order to get an ID. And then in 2017, Secretary of State John Merrill, this terrific young American white guy, put together a plan to purge 340,000 people from their inactive voter list and use the mail notification system to do that. Voter IDs are prejudiced against people of color because only about 25% of Americans or African Americans have government-issued photo IDs that would meet their requirements. In North Dakota, of course, Native American Indians don't have as many IDs. And in Texas, whereas they'll accept a handgun license, they won't accept a student ID with a picture. The state election officials are also major players in suppression. By closing polling stations, purging voter lists, creating burdensome provisional voting, closing the DMVs, challenging voter signatures, putting out threatening bulletins, and confusing election instructions. These are the states that were under pre-clearance prior to the elimination prior to Shelby. They were all required to pre-clear any change they would make in their voting laws to be sure they didn't have a disparate impact on the minority voters. Once that was gone, immediately Arizona, which is as Mariposa County had 60% of the residents, they slashed their polling places by 70% in between 2012 and 2016. And there's some evidence, though I haven't been able to find the resource, that if you move a polling station 5 miles from a community, you'll reduce voter participation by about 20%. So this closing of polling stations in minority communities is a very powerful way to suppress voting. In Texas, they closed 750 polling stations during that period of time, mostly in Black and Hispanic communities. The Leadership Conference on Civil Rights put together this report for September of 2019. The number of polling stations closed in these key states following Shelby. And purging is the other common way they suppress votes. And of course, Brian Kemp, when he was Secretary of State of Georgia, was kind of the purge king in terms of what he did. The 1993 National Voter Registration Act requires that states keep their lists of voters up to date. And so it's not that they shouldn't make changes as needed, it's how they target who they remove. In other words, the problem isn't whether registration rolls should be kept up to date, it's the method that these state election officials use to identify non-voters. They're very crafty about how they remove people. And the problem with getting purged is that when you show up to vote, you're not on the list. They give you a provisional provisional ballot. The trouble is, when you have a provisional ballot, you have to then go back within 2 days in most states to an election office and prove your identity. It's a step that most poor people can't do. They have a hard enough time getting to the polls, but to find an election office 2 days later and prove their identity. And so things like same-day voting, registration and voting eliminates all provisional ballots. And that's why most Republican states don't want it in place. There's another great video by Stacey Abrams called Suppressed, the fight to vote. It's a video on YouTube that talks about their experience in Georgia. And then there's the Russians hacking the Democratic Party, releasing emails fomenting partisan hatred, putting up false media posts, funding Republican candidates through shell corporations, promoting false conspiracy theories, hacking our election system, and undermining the trust. One of the great unanswered questions is what this relationship is between these two men. And it's still an unanswered question. It has to be deep, and it must be deeper than just mutual admiration. It has to do with their finances, and I hope someday we understand it. They certainly, over time, have done a lot to undermine our election, and they've also sent money through their dark money through their shell corporations to Republican candidates. And Citizens United really opened the door to this foreign dollar super PAC funding. Russians make better burglars because, unlike the Watergate burglars who went to jail, if you're a Russian burglar and you break into an office and steal information, you're out of reach of the Justice Department. Whereas something like 17 people in the Watergate scandal went to jail, only a few of these spent much time, and of course Trump has reduced the sentence on those in the yellow. I ran across this the other day, you may have seen this, which is the indictments by presidents that occurred during their presidency. And so you look at the the highest number of indictments occurred under Trump, Reagan, and Nixon. Although really, when Political Facts looked at it, they said there were 142 indictments under Republicans. There were only 3 under Democrats, Obama, Clinton, and Carter. And the 2 under Clinton didn't lead to any conviction. So when they talk about, the GOP talks about the law and order party, they have it turned around. In an op-ed piece on the New York Times recently, they summarized the fact that the bipartisan report released last Tuesday, a week ago, by the Republican-controlled Senate Intelligence Committee made the case and finalized the statement that Russia helped, and there was coordination, perhaps not collusion, but coordination between the two. This is still happening, and we're not well protected. The way that these foreign entities influence our election are they build an audience, creating an online entertainment piece such as TikTok is a possibility that you'd have to worry about. Once people are used to watching and staying with it, they flip the switch and begin publishing more divisive content. And then the third step is they urge their followers to take action, so they become kind of agents of the foreign government. And of course, President, the Senate, and the RNC have their own suppression tactics, falsely claiming fraud, undermining the trust in elections, deploying poll watchers, encouraging insurrection, threatening election chaos, withholding money from the post office, including with foreign governments. Trump has said constantly about fraud that is unsubstantiated. McConnell has refused to protect our election system by passing the needed protections and sending the money to the states. And then more recently, the Republican National Convention has decided to put 50,000 volunteer poll monitors out to challenge voters. If you remember back in 1981, it was an election for New Jersey governors. There was something called the National Ballot Security Task Force that was created by the Republicans that put people around the polls with badges and warning signs around the election to intimidate potential people of color and others from voting. And the Democratic Party sued the Republican National Party and won the lawsuit. And there was a decree put in place to prevent them from putting poll watchers in place. This went for 30 years and then expired 2 years ago. That activity back in 1981, the Republican won by 2,000 votes, and the strategist for the Republican governor where Paul Manafort and Roger Stone were the consultants that were working with those two at the time. So now Trump is talking about, in an interview with Sean Hannity, he's going to have sheriffs, law enforcement, others watching the polling stations to be sure that fraud doesn't occur. Kristen Clark, Committee for Civil Rights and the Law, says this is just an old, dirty voter suppression tactic. She says there's no doubt that this is about instilling fear and depressing participation in communities of color. This is the kind of signs in the past that have been put up by the Republican National Party in predominantly communities of color. So voting at home, and we have to step back and think about what COVID has done to this election. It's been a major blow for voter registration drives and canvassing. It's certainly an impediment to in-person voting at polling stations. And unfortunately, when you move to vote by mail, it essentially federalizes the election process, because elections are are controlled by the state. But once you move it into vote by mail, and you have the United States Postal Service as the primary delivering agent, it gives Republicans and President Trump a new tool to manipulate. And so to the extent that it's federalized the election, it's hurt. So it's possibilities of increasing voter participation are equally great. And then there's this opportunity for chaos that we're looking at. These are the states that require an excuse to vote by mail. There's still, and the problem is, if you have a false excuse, it is a potential felony, because you have to sign this thing. And these are the states where the Democratic Party is trying to get the legislation changed so that an excuse, that COVID is an excuse in itself for being able to vote by mail, the risk of that. And they're having some success in some states. In other states, they have lost that fight. Voting by mail has traditionally been very disparate across the country. So in the West Coast, over 50% of ballots are sent in those pink states, voting by mail, whereas in the dark red, you can see that less than 5% of votes have been traditionally sent in by mail. So there are different states have different experience with voting by mail and how to do it. Whereas on the West Coast, which are already pretty much many Democratic states, they are comfortable with that. On the East Coast, it's a new event. The GOP, though, has been alarmed by vote for mail for a variety of reasons. I think they're afraid it'll expose the lie about rampant voter fraud. It could be that Trump is just activating his base with new fear-mongering. But I think it is something else that they're really worried about. Vote at home nullifies many of their traditional, reliable GOP voter suppression tactics. For instance, when you can vote from home, it doesn't matter if you close all the polling stations. So all of the work they did on this disappears, because when you vote from home, you don't need a polling station. And if they're relying on that as a way to suppress the vote, you can see why they wouldn't want to vote from home. Similarly, if you vote from home, you're not going to be intimidated by their poll watchers. You can send in your ballot and you never have to show up there. So their traditional ways of intimidation and long lines and all that disappeared. Finally, I think the fact that when you vote from home, most of the states are required to tell you they're required to send you a ballot if you request it. If you're not on their voting poll list, you'll know early and you'll be able to register or get registered and not find yourself without an ability to vote in a provisional ballot on election day. So what are they trying to do to prevent vote by mail? Defunding the mail-in balloting initiative, underfunding it. The RNC, Republican National Committee, is suing states and that are attempting to implement mail-in ballot. threatening to defund the Postal Service, actually doing it, crippling mail delivery through their appointment of their new director, his actions, misinforming the public about the fraud, blocking appeals to ease restrictions, and then changing mail-in ballots based on signature, or challenging them versus is going to be likely to occur. Bill Barr has said that it has pushed this conspiracy theory about the risk of foreign governments printing ballots. The RNC is suing states like Pennsylvania, Iowa, and California. Corporate America is funding the RNC to do this. Remember that the massive tax cuts that have gone to corporate America can be turned around and used to fund their candidates through the Citizens United. So there's this terrible synchrony that occurs: tax cuts, increased support for their candidates. This was published recently, a list of billionaires that are supporting the RNC in trying to suppress the votes and challenging mail-in vote at the state level. And these are some of the organizations. One of them is James Davis, the chairman of New Balance Shoes. For instance, he's given $213,000 to the RNC to fund the legal challenge to mail-in voting. So I think we're seeing the corporate leaders exposed in their role in voter suppression. H.R. 1, as you know, was passed on a pure partisan vote in March 8, 2019. It had 3 divisions: voting, campaign finance, and ethics. And it had 10 titles. You can see under voting, there was election access, integrity, and security, campaign finance, reform, and ethics. And these are, if you read through this list, and I have a brochure that you may have seen, and I'll put it on the website for you. This is a terrific set of bills that address many of the issues that we're talking about. This is just the major issues related to voting. And if they can get these passed, it'll be one of the best democracy supporting bills that we've seen in decades. What this means is there's probably the brightest line we've ever seen between the two parties. It's between democracy and creeping dystopia. So we have the Democrats that are pushing for H.R. 1 to strengthen our democracy, a stronger democracy, a we the people candidate. And you have the Republican Party that's working from the autocrats' playbook, working to undermine our democracy, creating a dystopian autocracy, we the few. Bloomberg reported in March this headline: American politics is now Democrats versus authoritarians. Trump's endgame right now, between now and the end of the election, are to disenfranchise target voters by late mailing the ballots or slow counting the ballots through the Postal Service, deploying poll watchers or police near polling stations to intimidate, selectively rejecting absentee ballots due to signature mismatch, creating election chaos and force a contested election into the courts and Congress, and at the extreme, claim election fraud, nullify the election, and deploy domestic police to suppress the protests. Timothy Snyder said, "Be wary of paramilitaries in his book on tyranny." He said, when the men with guns who have always claimed to be against the system start wearing uniforms and marching with torches and pictures of the leader, the end is nigh. And when the pro-leader paramilitary and official police and military intermingle, the end has come. When these gentlemen on the steps of the Michigan State House entered the establishment with their weapons and the police stood by, it felt like that this was an intermingling of like-minded people. Masha Gessen, who grew up in the Soviet Union and has a couple books, The Future is History, about Russian loss of their democracy, and more recently surviving autocracy. She said that when Bush signed the Homeland Security Act in 2002 and created the Department of Homeland Security in response to 9/11, the purpose was to create a coordinated security agency to protect us from ruthless killers who moved and plotted in the shadows. That was what Bush said. She said that Putin spoke in a similar manner in 1999 when he rose to power. The former KGB colonel vowed to hunt down terrorists and snuff them out. She said that these Homeland Security police always begin by protecting the border from criminals and aliens that inevitably turn and target citizens, anarchists, and protesters. The Department of Homeland Security has 360,000 employees altogether, and Chad Wolf, who is the acting secretary, has never been confirmed by the Senate in this role, like many of Trump's cabinet leaders. You can see that within the Department of Homeland Security, the bottom boxes are all the different departments that fall under his control, including FEMA, U.S. Coast Guard, Immigration, Customs Enforcement, ICE. And you can see their numbers: 45,000 sworn officers and agents in U.S. Customs, 40,000 active in the U.S. Coast Guard, 20,000 in ICE. U.S. Customs and Border Police have a territory that their jurisdiction, which is 100 miles from a border. Unfortunately, the border is described as any edge, so you can see that it's not only the border with Canada, but it's the border with oceans. And some 200 million people, nearly 2/3 of all Americans, live within this border zone, which is defined by the Justice Department as 100 air miles from the U.S. land or coastal boundary. 9 of the country's 10 largest cities lie within the zone. It touches 38 states and encompasses all of Connecticut, Delaware, Florida, Hawaii, Maine, Massachusetts. So you can see that the border customs and border police have a broad range where they can legitimately provide a law enforcement role. And even within 25 miles of any border patrol agents can enter private land without a warrant or an owner's permission. So not only does he have Homeland Security and all of their police force under his control, and the Justice Department and the U.S. Marshals under his control through Bill Barr, but more recently now, the New York Police Union have decided to endorse Trump, and the New York State Trooper Union have come out and endorsed Trump, saying that Donald Trump has our back. Joe Biden supported cops in the past, but he's turned his back on us. And so they're voicing their, acting as if they're victims in this confrontation with their racism. Thomas Friedman in an editorial said, here is a sentence I never in a million years thought I would ever write or read. This November, for the first time in our history, the United States of America may not be able to conduct a free and fair election should President Trump be defeated by Joe Biden. Have a legitimate and peaceful transfer of power. And of course, Barack Obama, that is said at the convention, this is how democracies wither until it's no longer a democracy at all. We can't let this happen. Don't let them take away your power. Don't let them take away your democracy. Make a plan right now for how you're going to get involved and vote. Do it as early as you can and tell your friends and family how they can vote too. Do what Americans have done for over 2 centuries when faced with even tougher times than these. All those quiet heroes who found the courage to keep marching, keep pushing in the face of hardship and injustice. 8 weeks to save our democracy. So what do we need to do? We need to make an 8-week tracking grid for our election activities, and I'll get back to this in a second. We've got to donate more money than we've ever been comfortable to do to our party and candidates. We need to speak out about the threat to our democracy, about the degradation of our pillars. We have to explain how our democracy is very difficult to regain once it's lost. share this kind of an information or other PowerPoints or other podcasts. Help friends, help neighbors to vote, volunteer, vote by mail early, and check early with election officials to be sure you're registered to vote. I think that each of us ought to put together an 8-week grid like this, and over the top, talk about the different things you can do, whether it's donate money, make a call, send a letter, send an email, volunteer at a phone bank, place a yard sign, check on voters, present publicly. And if we aren't doing something every day, we're negligent. We're not going to be able to look our children in their eyes and say we've done everything we could. And I think this is an 8-week sprint to the final result. If we lose, I think actually that the Indivisible network is one of the most important networks in our country. If we find that we lose or there's a contested election and we need to get into the streets, massive peaceful resistance, we have to be prepared to flood the streets, go on strike, to disrupt commerce, confront police, to shame our neighbors, and maybe to flee the country if you're in a certain circumstance. This little book on the right is something I'd recommend everybody get a copy of and think about, because Gene Sharp has thought about from dictatorship to democracy for a long time and has a whole list of the kind of strategies and tactics that peaceful resistance can be used. And it's way more than most of us usually think about. And it was used during the Arab Spring by many of the organizers in those communities. And then the Indivisible network has said, before Election Day, we must build the infrastructure for safe voting during the pandemic. On Election Day, we must battle voter suppression. And then they make the statement after Election Day, we must have a network of grassroots patriots, activists, already in place, prepared to defend the votes and send Trump packing. We already have resistance in the streets, some very brave people. The wall of moms. I mean, the only thing they could have done even more powerful is if they would have had a plate of cupcakes to offer the police officers. I think that this is really powerful stuff. Unfortunately, the COVID crisis has made it even more dangerous for us to go into the streets, but we're going to have to do this if the whole chaos breaks down. What we're looking for is this, and you've maybe seen this before. This is the New York Times on January 1st. Biden inaugurated, nightmare is over. Senate approves new cabinet, GOP apologizes to the nation. And down on the left, Attorney General, which they stated, Kamala Harris, indicts Barr. Ethics chief makes presidential lying a federal crime. Twitter bans Trump for life after last major meltdown. So this is what we're hoping will occur by January. The 2020 election is the single most important election for our future. A second win for Trump and the GOP will be a green light for further dismantling of our democratic institutions and will accelerate unbridled corruption. Thank you. Happy to answer any questions if you want to, if you have time for that, or on chat or anyway.
We don't have any, we did have one question in the chat, which is asking about how we find out about where and how many voters have been purged throughout the state.
Oh, that's very difficult to do that. In fact, you know, even after the fact, they couldn't put those numbers together without kind of a retrospective view of what these election officials do. One of the biggest problems is the election officials can work in the dark in terms of their purging activities without any oversight. And it's one of the problems with having an election official being someone appointed by a governor, for instance, or because they are oftentimes linked in with the party and doing the work of the party rather than the work of the people.
There's a question that's come up a couple of times as you've been presenting. Will you make the PowerPoint available? And thanking you.
Yes, I'll send it to Mary and Jane in a PDF format so that it's easy to come across and she can distribute. Or if you don't get it, you saw my email at the end, dale.p.anderson@gmail.com. And if you just send me an email, I'll attach it and send it to you that way too.
And Erin is asking from Gainesville, where can we find out more about how to help Indivisible turn out the vote in Florida?
I think that's your question for your Indivisible leaders.
And here we have one from, I hope I'm not slaughtering your name, Gilia. As Deputy Voter Protection for Sarasota, I have been part of a number of Zoom meetings on voter suppression. This has by far been the most informative and thorough. Thank you. That wasn't a question, but I'm sure people would join it.
Thank you.
Oh, okay. So this is from Diane. Some members of the 2018 Electoral College failed, I think we mean 2016, we do. Electoral College failed to vote in accordance with voter results. How do you prevent this?
So I think didn't the Supreme Court recently affirm the fact that that the Electoral College voters must vote in alignment with the election results? I think they've taken that uncertainty out, and that there isn't likelihood that you'll get rogue electoral members voting against the will of the people.
I think they have to follow the law of the state that they come from, whatever that law is. But yes, they wouldn't allow just rogue.
Right. I think that recently was adjudicated in the Supreme Court, but I can't remember. I read that. I think there was a question about whether there were poll closures in Florida. I haven't seen any numbers on that. Remember that when Governor Scott was in charge, remember they changed the early voting by knocking out the 3 days that included the Sunday before Election Day in order to reduce African American voting, because that was a big day that souls to the polls, right? And so they've done their own interventions intended to suppress vote. And you know what's so disappointing is, you know, a party that the only way they can win is to suppress the vote isn't a party that this country needs. We need parties that are competing on policy. And the reason they're in that circumstances is because the dollars that flow to them from their minority of powerful billionaire supporters won't let them move away from those ridiculous policy positions that they hold.
Quick question from Vicki. Can we publish the PowerPoint in our newsletters?
Sure. You can attach it. You can use this PowerPoint any way you want. I have no ownership or copyright or anything, so you can send it to friends, or if that's what it's for, just distribute it. The problem is that, you know, in 2 weeks it'll be out of date.
Well, let's hope not. Here's another question. I think it's rhetorical, from Cindy Lou. Where in the Constitution does it call America a democracy?
It doesn't.
Yeah, that's always an issue about, you know, when we get to that part about that book on how to protect a constitutional democracy, kind of addresses that issue of people that say, well, we're a republic, not a democracy. And you know, either way, officials are elected through an election process, whether you want to call it a democracy or not. And If you say that they are undermining our republic, that's fine too. I'm talking about the broad definition of a democracy.
So now a question, can you please repeat your email?
Dale, D-A-L-E dot P, like in Paul, dot Anderson with an O, at gmail.com.
From Kathleen, what do you make of the Kanye West candidacy and the GOP support thereof?
I don't know, you know, as a physician, when you look at Kanye West and the discussions about his bipolar nature, that is kind of a typical bipolar response of someone that needs to adjust their treatment, is that they would believe that they can be president of the United States. And, you know, he has, there's an article in the Atlantic, by the way, the Atlantic, you know, the old Atlantic Monthly, but now the Atlantic magazine, has had just terrific articles in there around democracy and other issues. And one recent one by Ann Applebaum is about collaborators and the people around Trump that have given up on what you would have expected to be their ideals in order to align themselves with a very corrupt demagogue. And she lists about 7 reasons that people collaborate. And I think that it's good to read that, because you understand sometimes when you get in the sphere of power, it is so energizing to you, you just don't want to leave it. And I think once Donald Trump brought Kanye West into the office and sat down with him, here's a young man that really won't walk away from that kind of power recognition, regardless of what it means. I don't know, the latest is that he's, you know, the intent is to try and reduce the African American vote. I don't know if it'll work. I don't think it will.
So next question from William, do you recommend that we abandon mail-in voting and vote in person?
No, I think you should use mail-in voting. But I think you know, if it's late, if you're doing it late, you should drop it off yourself at the voting station or in a drop box if drop boxes are available. You should look at your own signature on your driver's license and make sure your signature on the ballot matches it. If your signature is changed because of health conditions or anything, you should re-register. One of the things in Florida, if you look on their site, is that if they see a mismatch, they're required to contact you and let you know that there's a mismatch, and you have to bring some additional verification in. So that's good to the extent that Florida is doing that. I think mail by ballot is a safe way, and I would recommend it, but you should do it the day you get your ballot in the mail. And you know, you can sign up for all future ballots to be by mail. If you connect that, they will automatically send them to you for all elections, primaries, and going forward for the next several years. I think it's a great way to vote. Again, it prevents you from having to stand in a line and put yourself at risk, but it also prevents something like happened in Georgia, where they had a voting machine calamity. They didn't work, right? They weren't online. There were some new voting machines. If you're standing in that line when a voting machine fails, the likelihood that you're going to have your vote counted is pretty nil. And mail-in voting feels much safer, so I would do that. A third of Floridians have been using mail-in voting.
So a related question from Carol, since vote by mail has a high rate of disqualification, how do we address this?
No, I don't think it does in Florida. I think in some states that may be true. Someone else made the comment that when you sign up for mail-in voting, that it's a 2-year limit. It's not in perpetuity, so that's true.
So we have a lot more questions. We can stop whenever you're getting tired, Dr. Anderson, and we can send the
I
rest
learned-
to you.
I learned things. We could go another few minutes. Why don't we do it?
Okay. So this is, and please share address choose-democracy.us, where people can sign up for training in nonviolent direct action. That's not a question. Here's a question from Larry of Mandarin. In 2018, Florida voted, it looks like 25% vote by mail. Does Florida have enough money to make and send envelopes and applications and receive and count the 75% vote by mail on November 3rd?
Yeah, I think they do. I think they're gearing up to do that. And of course, the bigger question is, will the post office be able to deliver it in a timely fashion? That's why, you know, if you don't get your ballot, you need multiple strategies. Your ballot doesn't come in time, you need to go stand in line. You know, that's going to be the way that it occurs. So you need a strategy, and for those people that are kind of shut-ins, one of the most important things you could do would be to help them work through the complexity maybe of how to fill out a vote, a mail-in vote, because it isn't, if you've done it, it isn't that necessarily that easy to understand what you're supposed to do on that ballot. So helping somebody walk through it, helping them deliver it if they need to, in terms of how they can deliver it, whether a ride or something is going to make a difference. And that's the kind of thing you could put on your checklist that you did today, is help somebody understand how to mail in about the ballot. And I think it's going to be those little small things we do between now and the election that are going to win it.
Well, this is a related question from Margot. Where can we get the most bang for our buck at this time in order to win the election, in addition to Indivisible, of course?
Well, I think through the Democratic Party and really working and helping fund those key. I made asked a question to the Democratic. There was a webinar recently with some Democratic leaders, and I tried to ask the question of how would you, if you had $20,000, for instance, to donate this year, how would you split it up between president, key Senate races, local races, and so forth? And of course, they wouldn't answer. They weren't willing to make that kind of consideration. But there are some key state races, Arizona, others. You ought to find out what those are and send them $20 for those candidates, because winning the Senate is equally important to winning the presidency. In fact, it may be in some ways more important. If you control the Senate and the House, you'd be able to impeach the president if you won. And I think, I think you got to pay a lot of attention to those key Senate races. There are 4 or 5 of them that are up for grabs. It's really important that we win that. And then as far as local candidates, I hate to say it, but if there are candidates that really don't look like they have a chance to win, though your heart might be in to support them, I think you need to go after those races that you think you can win with your dollars. That's just my personal thinking.
I'm looking down here for more questions rather than comments. And so if somebody wants to jump in with a question, I think I might have reached the bottom here.
Well, comments are okay.
Oh, here's one. How do you feel about the oops, I just lost it. The chat went away when the screen sharing stopped. Hang on a minute.
Who's sharing this? Somebody put up.
Oh, who is sharing? I think Lori is sharing this.
Sorry,
Okay.
I was on mute. Yeah, I was just putting that up while you were looking, just as a reminder before folks jump off and we close out, is our next event is we are joining up with Palm Beach Indivisibles on Saturday, September 26th for a presentation, the Mega Supreme Court. So you want to make sure you join us for that. You'll get an email after this event with Dr. Dale Anderson's presentation and information. But I did want to bring that to your attention. I'm sorry, didn't mean to
No, it's fine. It's
throw
fine.
off your.
Thank you for inviting me. and really share my PowerPoint if you think it'll do any good, and let's put together our 10-week plan or 8-week plan. I think each of us needs to really look at our calendars and make that commitment, because if we don't do it, it's not going to get done.
Thank you so much. Is there any other questions, Jane?
I lost one from Herb, whom I know, and maybe he can just jump in if it hasn't been answered.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
I was interested in how you feel about the Constitution giving such extraordinary power to one person. All this stuff that's been going on for the last 3 years, he's used it more than anyone in history. In my feeling, a nefarious way, but nonetheless, we give him the power to do that.
I'm totally with you. He has way too much power. The president has way too much power, and unfortunately, the Homeland Security Act and those acts that created that Homeland Security Force, Border Patrol Force, adds a whole nother level of potential power in his hands to manipulate the population. So they really need to, we need to really change some fundamental things about the presidential power.
The other thing is that Barr was well known for being a proponent of strong executive power before he even came in.
That's true. That's true, and I think that was why he was chosen. I think, among other things. I've never seen a, and I don't know why he's still a member of the bar associations. I'm surprised the New York bar hasn't taken away his license over what he's done.
If one looks at the power that's wielded by the Justice Department, it's absolutely stunningly frightening.
It's frightening.
Frightening when you see what he oversees and how he is so definitely connected. So that troubles me, but I know this is a long way down the road. The first
well,
thing,
no, not that far. It's not that far down the road, unfortunately.
Well, thank you for doing all that you do.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for listening, and I appreciate the invitation to speak.
Well, thank you so much for spending the evening with us, and thank everybody who came and listened and is going to distribute the PowerPoint and work like hell for the next 7 weeks or so.
Absolutely.
Bye.
Thank you.
Gail. Thanks
Thank
very
you.
much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. That was great.